thank you very much. It's very, very inspiring. I think I'm going to shoot off with two questions so that the audience has time to get ready for your questions. The first one is about the monks. We know that in 1988, actually the monks kind of were leading the transition, the change, were challenging the status quo at that time. That shows to us that the monks actually, among the Buddhists, they took a stand. That also means that they do have their value system at work. So they made a judgment. Now, this is no more to be tolerated, and something must be done. Okay. Now, when we are faced with the ethnic cleansing now that we're witnessing, my question is, well, it turns out that the Buddhists themselves are the perpetrators. And there are very, very little dissenting voices. So how do you explain this? What happens to the Buddhist philosophy with their concept of human rights? So what's happening there?
Well, thanks very much, Ying-Tai, for that question. In fact, in 88, the monks were not leading, though they were participating. The students were leading in 88, but they did lead in 2007. So the Saffron Uprising in 2007, named because of the robes that they wear. And famously, they marched past Aung San Suu Kyi's gate. She's still under house arrest at the time. She comes to the gate in tears, and they acknowledge her, and she acknowledges them. So it looks like a perfect meeting between the democratic icon, Aung San Suu Kyi, at her gate, and the monks filing past. And this is only 11 years ago. So how on earth did ethnic cleansing happen 10 years later, 2007, 2017? It seems almost inconceivable that there could be this change around. But the Myanmar monkhood is far more complex than that. I mean, you always had a hierarchy which was largely co-opted by the military. So that the senior, the Sangha is the name for the monkhood, but the senior monks were always a very conservative force in the society. They gained in their monasteries, in that the generals have always given very generously to build new temples and to make some merit in the society. They gained personally. They gained televisions, they gained cars, they gained a lot of access in the society. So they were never the ones, they were never the ones on the street. They were never the ones who were kind of leading the direction of Buddhism within the society. It was younger monks who were leading the Saffron Revolution in 2007. And what we've seen in the last decade is that there's still a lot of radicalism among many of the younger monks. But now the older monks have been politicized. They no longer have this kind of insider channel to the military. They're in many ways just part of civil society. They're just out there. And looking back, just in the kind of landscape of the cities, you used to walk down the street of, say, Yangon or Mandalay or a major Myanmar town, you scarcely notice the monasteries. When you go today, they're absolutely festooned with flags. And on the weekends, senior monks, not junior monks, but senior monks are setting up stall on 32nd Street this Saturday, on 33rd Street next Saturday, on 34th Street the next Saturday. They clear the entire street, they put down rush matting. The faithful come, they congregate, and they listen to senior monks telling them that the most important challenge for the faith now is defending the faith. So it's become very, very core. It's no longer other issues like, say, democracy or the living standards of the people, which used to be among their concerns. It's now we are under attack from Muslims, from global Islam, from this, there's a kind of existential challenge to the country. And so the senior leaders of the monkhood are now coming out and telling the Myanmar people that they need to mobilize against the global Islamic threat, and in particular against the threat that they see in their own society. So it's a different cohort of monks that are political today compared with 2007. And the agenda has really come home to them as one of defending the faith, rather than of seeking all sorts of peripheral benefits for the people.
So are you saying that what they're doing now is no different from what they have done before? In other words, are you saying that the Buddhist monks they have never been the so-called progressive forces in the society, unlike what, for example, what the Catholics did in the Eastern Bloc before 1989?
They've been both. I mean, they've been conservative and they've been progressive, and they still are. They still are to this day. But because of the events in Rakhine State and the whole mobilization against what is seen as a terrorist threat from ARSA, from the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, senior monks are now mobilizing the faithful around that. But it's a very complex movement. There are 500,000 monks in Myanmar. 500,000, people devote themselves to Buddhism, live their lives as Buddhist monks. And within that 500,000, there are these different cohorts, senior and junior. They're still existing in tension with each other. You can still find monks today. We interviewed some of them who feel there's no place for the kind of rhetoric which is now issuing forth from the senior monkhood. But they have become ascendant on the back of this Islamic challenge as it's seen. I mean, the other thing that's changed is just the explosion of social media. There are 20 million people out of 50 million in Myanmar are on Facebook. And Burmese language Facebook is a very frightening place to be. I mean, it's absolutely full of openly racist and xenophobic rhetoric, some of it coming from Buddhist monks. And so their reach has become also very extensive.
The Rohingyas are not the only Muslims who are living in Myanmar, and there are recognized Muslim states as well, or minorities as well. So, two questions in relation to this. One, the way was this ethnic cleansing, did other Muslim minorities speak up? Do they have an attitude about this? And two, so why are the Rohingya Muslims targeted?
Yeah. One of the official 135 ethnic minorities is the Kaman Muslim group, Kaman, which is resident in Rakhine State, just as the Rohingya largely are. So they do have official status. They have had all the way through. So on your first question, so no, the Rohingya are not the only Muslim group. There are Chinese Muslims in Myanmar. There are Myanmar Muslims who seek a kind of assimilationist. I mean, to all intents and purposes, they are mainstream Myanmar people, except that they have an Islamic faith. And then there are the more aggressive Muslims who are promoting some form of identity politics. So that's also very complex. Did other groups speak up? No, largely not. And in fact, some of the people that we interviewed were critical of the Rohingya for endangering the security of other Muslims in the society. So that's very difficult. There's a lot of self-segregation going on in Myanmar. There used to be neighborhoods in Yangon, in Mandalay, that were ethnically and religiously mixed. They may still be ethnically mixed, but they're not religiously mixed anymore. There's a known Muslim quarter. Buddhists moved out, Muslims moved in. And Myanmar people, often you can talk to people who are very liberal on every single issue, except on this one, when they're extremely illiberal. I was at a conference a few years ago with one of my doctoral students who's a Myanmar Muslim. He's studying lack of social integration between Muslims and Buddhists in Myanmar. And he gave a very good and basic presentation at the conference about that. The next morning I'm having breakfast, and this person who I knew fairly well came over to see me, chat. And then at a certain point he said, that guy yesterday, is he your student? And I said, yes, he is. And he said, you shouldn't let him out in a public place to say things like that. This is one of the most right-on or liberal persons I know who said that. Why are the Rohingya targeted? Well, it goes back to World War II when there was at the time of the Japanese interregnum from 42 to 45. Rakhine State, which is about as far from Rangoon as it was then as you can get, it's very distant, was largely lawless. And there was a Muslim insurgency then. And there were concerns then that part of Burma might become part of what was to become East Pakistan, before Bangladesh, East Pakistan had independence. So there's always been those kinds of concerns that this is a frontier land with a people who identify with a religion belonging to the neighbor rather than the majority religion of this place, that they might be seeking some kind of status which could either mean loss of territory on the margins or even, in the worst telling, could mean that Burma itself becomes an Islamic state. It seems crazy to all of us, given the 4%. But for Myanmar people, they will tell you that many parts of Southeast Asia were not Muslim until a century ago or 2 centuries ago, but have become Muslim. And they see themselves as really the last defenders of the faith, maybe alongside, say, the Thais. So when I use this term existential, they see it as an existential crisis.
Ian, could you say a few words about what you mentioned a while ago about the dividing line between the coast, the periphery Burmese and the core Burmese? And the reason why I'm asking you this is because I read some history records about about 3 years between 1942 and 1945 when the Japanese armies were in Burma, and so the Japanese accounts actually recorded that the local Burmese people were helping the Japanese fighting against the Allies. Okay, so apparently internally there was the divide. And does this divide have anything to do with the problems that we're witnessing nowadays?
It does. I mean, the independence settlement in 1947, just ahead of independence in January 1948, provided for secession after 10 years for a number of named minorities. Very unusual for a constitution to say that. It was kind of, let's give this place, independent Burma, a 10-year window. And if we haven't pulled it all together at the end of the 10 years, then secession is a possibility for these named states. That disappeared in 1962. The constitution was trashed in 1962 with the military coup. But you already had, an evidently patchwork state. And the sense among many of the minorities was that they'd fought with the British, they'd been loyal to the British, and by the British they had been promised a better deal at independence, not to just get folded into Burma, but to be given Karen land or a Kachin state, these kinds of things. What our data show is that that's actually not as big an issue as you might expect. I mean, that reading of would you dislike as a neighbor on your street somebody from one of the official ethnic minorities, and the Burma Buddhists, only 5% say yes, we would dislike that. Everybody else is fine with that, suggests that you can actually build bridges across those fault lines. And I think the propaganda around the 135 national races has been very, very successful. It's made those 135 part of the family. It's made everybody else definitely not part of the family, which is where the Rohingya are, because they are not named. I should say one other thing about the Rohingya. Making them number 136 on that list doesn't necessarily give them their own homeland. One of the pieces in the briefing pack suggests that should they be named as an official ethnic minority, they would automatically get a Rohingya homeland. That's not the case. They would simply get citizenship. So there aren't 135 homelands in Burma, in Myanmar. There's a Burma core and 7 named states: Kachin state, Karen state, Shan state. Nobody's talking about Rohingya state, but it's a question of citizenship for people who call themselves Rohingya.
My last question. We know that Ian is also a collector of Myanmar art, especially from the living artists who live in Myanmar. And you socialize and you know these artists as well. So when you are in there and you are having a conversation with the local artists there, what do you get from them? How do you understand the intellectual climate there? Because I noticed something very interesting. When you come to Taiwan or many countries and you want to get to know kind of an intellectual climate there, you probably talk to writers. But you specifically say you get that from talking to painters there. So what do you get? What kind of picture do you get when you talk to the local painters who have lived all their lives there and then they get out of the country? How do they feel about the whole thing?
Thanks very much for that. Let me just say what I think is interesting about painters, which is that they require no interpretation in the sense that you can take their painting and you can display it, and it is still an authentic statement by a Myanmar person living through this moment in time. Whereas if you take the writings of a Myanmar writer, nobody in this audience can read it, or maybe one or two. It has to be translated, it has to be interpreted. Now, we may not interpret the painting in the way a Myanmar person would, but nevertheless, it's an authentic document. And I do think it's absolutely essential that the wider world understand this complex country far better than it has done. It is not a black and white country, even though that's how we've seen it for years. It used to be Aung San Suu Kyi versus the generals. Now it's everybody else versus the Rohingya. But this is a country of just infinite shades of grey, and it needs to be understood on those terms. And one way of doing that is by looking at authentic documents. And as I say, we may not get every message that's in a Burmese painting, but it is itself an authentic document. So what do they say? Unfortunately, they say much the same as everybody else about the Rohingya. I mean, this really goes deep into the society. The person I quoted criticizing my PhD student is emblematic of Myanmar intellectuals. And as I say, without a break in the conversation, it's not as if they're talking about female empowerment, they're talking about gay rights or whatever, and then they say, but also I believe in this, and I apologize for that. It's seamless. They see no contradiction whatsoever in holding their array of liberal views and then something that we would find deeply illiberal and abhorrent. So on those kinds of issues, they're mainstream, frankly. And the mainstream is extremely wide, and it encompasses pretty much everybody. On other issues, they're a bit more interesting. They've always been deeply critical of Aung San Suu Kyi. You know, she's loved throughout the country, but if you want to find a Myanmar person who is prepared to take her on, so to speak, then speak to a Yangon intellectual, because she's not embraced them. They, in return, do not embrace her. And this was true even before she became state councillor, even back in 2011, 12, 13. She's never built the big tent. She's never reached out to the 88 generation students. When the candidate list for the 2015 general election was drawn up by the NLD, in fact by Aung San Suu Kyi, there was one person from the 88 generation student movement on that list, and not a major figure. We'd all expected that she would reach out to the students who'd been not under house arrest for 15 out of 20 years, but in jail for 20 out of 20 years, and were released from appalling conditions. We all thought, the Burma watchers and Myanmar watchers, that this would become part of her coalition, but it never did. And nor does she reach out to the new kind of civil society leaders. She has almost no contact with them. She is not inviting them to Naypyidaw for advice or discussion, mirroring how she runs her party. I mean, her party is really a reflection of a charismatic leader. It is a charismatic party. There's only one woman in the cabinet named Aung San Suu Kyi. There were only 15% women on the NLD candidate list. There were no Muslims, not even one. And I mean, the candidate list is about 1,150 names. So just 15% women, not a single Muslim name. This is all deeply worrying when we're talking about the major vehicle of democracy, the NLD.
Very few women and no Muslims. She should get along with Trump very well. I have to open up now. So we'll take questions from the audience, and may I ask you to keep your question very precise and short, so that he could listen to more questions. And also, if you don't feel comfortable raising your question in English, it's fine with Chinese. Okay. So shall we? This one first, number 1 and 2. And we take 3 at one time. 1, 2, 3. All right, there, please. And please keep your questions brief.
Dr. Holliday, again on Aung San Suu Kyi, I know that the UN had issued a report in August, basically reprimanding the military leaders of Myanmar for the genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. But to the whole international media, Aung San Suu Kyi seems to be taking the fall for the whole thing. You know, they're retracting her awards and all that kind of thing. Considering her present status, which is sort of like a shadow president, and the fairly concentrated participation of the military in the parliament, and her basically loss of control over the military, I mean, does she even have the power to do anything? Does she have any executive power? Or is this all very unfair simply because she has been so idolized?